2 Samuel chapter 12, beginning at verse 1 through to 7a. The Lord sent Nathan to David. When he came to him, he said, There were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveller came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveller who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, As surely as the Lord lives, that man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and had no pity. Then Nathan said to David, You are the man. Have you ever noticed how easy it is to be righteous when you don't have a personal stake in the process, the outcome, or the people concerned? It's quite easy, isn't it, to look dispassionately at something and come up with the right answer. It seems like God can work through us quite successfully when we have no personal desires at stake. But as soon as we have something personally at stake, quite often righteousness goes out the window and personal preference and personal desire and decision making override what we know to be right and wrong. And this is the complete reason that David is the man who suffers his own unjust and therefore just condemnation. His unjust behavior we have seen in 2 Samuel chapter 11. His just behavior is right here. We know he's a man who has justice at the forefront of his heart, but yet he's a man of evil, a man of desire, and he's a man of cover-up and deceit. And when he has a personal stake in the outcome and a personal desire in the process of removing guilt and evil from how others perceive him, he will do anything. And we've seen it in 2 Samuel 11. But right here, we're presented with a case. Now, for those of us who have read the Bible many times, you would read this and see this as a parable. But I think we're supposed to see it initially as an act of judgment. And it's only seen as a parable through Nathan's words, where he applies the description of the event to David. You are the man. Until that point in time, David was being told a story as he, the king, was being asked to judge upon. Now, this occurred many times in ancient Israel. Generally speaking, cases like this would have went to judges and magistrates who would have given their decision on it. But occasionally, if a decision couldn't be reached because there was something either about the case or the judgment, then it could have come before the king. And maybe David has been thinking this is what is occurring. And so it begins with Nathan coming before David. Now, we can't just gloss over even that. If you've ever had to bring a word of rebuke to a person, you will know that it's a very difficult thing to do because you are fearful of the response. How much more so when the person you are bringing it to is a king, is a man of authority, a man above you, a person through God's understanding now being given to you, you've just made aware of, and you may have heard the innuendo and the court gossip as now Bathsheba is in the court and Uriah is dead. You think, well, that's quite a novel way of things happening. And now you realize it wasn't real novel at all or luck or coincidence. It was David's plan. And you're going to go present to the king this plan and its outcome and how God viewed it. And we have seen that when the prophet has done this in the past, like Samuel to Saul, it doesn't all turn out well. So Nathan is courageous. It's the type of courage we need. And it's the type of courage that Nathan implements based on he knows that it's God's will for David to have this knowledge presented to him. But he presents it to him in a way that Nathan is not the one condemning him. David condemns himself by his own words. He condemns himself by his own righteousness, a righteousness that he knows comes from God. The story continues after Nathan comes. In verse 2 and 1 it says, There were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. Now initially, remember, this is a story that David is asking to judge upon. He's not seeing it as a story but a real life event. We know it's a story, and so we know already that David is the rich man and the poor man is Uriah. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle. That's David. He's the king. It communicates the power and balance already between the two and the wealth and balance. But the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. The ewe lamb is Bathsheba, his wife. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food and drank from his cup, even slept in his arms. I think this is meant to communicate a relationship. Not a relationship, of course, in a silly way between a man and his sheep, but between a man and his wife. In other words, they were together. He should have seen that. They were together. It was like a daughter to him. The word daughter in Hebrew is the same word for that is Bathsheba, daughter of Sheba, and the pun would have seemingly been lost at this point, but no doubt is reinforced as soon as David knows the story is about him and his relationship with Uriah and Bathsheba. Now a traveller came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveller who had come to him. You may have noticed in 2 Samuel 11, David has already acquired, as we know earlier, multiple wives, at least 6. He has children running about all over the place. It would have been hard for him to catch 5 minutes by himself, but somehow he managed to, in other words, he did all this on purpose. Deliberate decision-making by David. He had wives, he had a family. He did not need to take another man's. But yet, because of his desire, his greed, he did so. His jealousy then paid out, sadly, in the life of Uriah. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. In other words, he took the wife of Uriah as his own because he did not care for her. He did not care for Uriah. He only cared for himself. David burned with anger. It's like his conscience has got the better of him. You'll notice he makes a proclamation of anger judgment based not on the righteousness of the law, but on the anger of his own heart. It was not a death penalty sentence to kill the man who had stolen the ewe and prepared it for himself. The consequence would have been to pay back, for example, here 4 times the amount. But David's anger at the justification that this man offered, he had no pity, burned in him. In other words, he's condemning himself by his own anger. Maybe in the background of his own heart is this wallowing of guilt and self-pity that he himself is having about himself. And so his anger is a sign of his own heart, a sign of his own anger, a sign of how he views maybe even himself. But it certainly is a sign of his conscience getting the better of him. He burned with anger. As sure as the man lives, this man must die. Well, he must not die according to the law. He must die according to David's view of self-righteous judgment. But it's self-righteous that has gone completely awry because David's heart is out from the Lord. His anger, his guilt is chewing him up, and he cannot do anything about it. He must pay for that lamb, so he gets to the real answer when his calmness comes back to him. He must pay for the lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing. So he talks about the action, and he had no pity. So he speaks not merely about the action, but about the heart that went into it. David has had this now said to him by Nathan. You're the man. Those words must have cut him to the heart. You're the man. As soon as he said it, he must have realized that this story was not a real-life historic event, but a parable designed to teach him that he himself is the guilty party whose deed has been exposed, and God, through the prophet Nathan, has revealed it to him and has now come to him and to see what he's going to do. We'll see what he does in tomorrow's study together, but we can see right now that David is guilty, he's wallowing in guilt, and he can do nothing but his guilt, but be angry at himself, but project it out to others. He knew the right thing. He knew what he should have done. But because his own desires got in the way of justice, he could not see the right thing to do. Or more importantly, even if he did see it, he could not make himself do it because his own evilness got the better of him. As I said at the start, it is easy to be just and righteous when you don't have a stake in the game. David placed a stake in the game, and the stake is now being placed in his own heart. What is he going to do? We'll see more about that tomorrow. Amen.